So Alex Jones has been ordered to pay 45.2 million on top of a 4.1 million in a defamation lawsuit brought forward by the parents of one of the victims of Sandy Hook. And many in the media and social media are applauding this as the end for Alex Jones, that this will be his demise. But the reality is he might not have to pay a dime. So I want to explain today why that is and what this case really was and what it wasn't. So first of all, this is just the first
One
suit
of
in
the
a line of
things you've been
several that
talking
Jones is
about
facing.
on your show
He has another
is
one
your
or two in
allegation
Connecticut and another
that
one or
government
maybe even
officials
two in
are
Texas. He is
aiding.
facing a total of 13 plaintiffs, and this recent case was regarding two of them. So let's start with this judgment and what it was and what it was and what it wasn't. So Alex Jones was not actually found to be liable because of the things he said. This is important. So Alex Jones can credibly say he hasn't been ruled a liar or anything like that. Instead, the judgment against him was by default. So here's NPR's reporting about 9 months ago. Family members of some of the victims of the 2012 Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting have won a court battle by default against right-wing media personality and conspiracy theorist Alex Jones and his InfoWars website. Connecticut Superior Court Judge Barbara Bellis cited the defendant's willful noncompliance with the discovery process as the reasoning behind the ruling. Bellis noted that defendants failed to turn over financial and analytics data that were requested multiple times by the Sandy Hook family plaintiffs. Mr. Jones was given every opportunity to comply, but when he chose instead to withhold evidence for more than 2 years, the court was left with no choice but to rule as it did today, Matai said. While the families are grateful for the court's ruling, they remain focused on uncovering the truth. So what this means, this was a default judgment, meaning that just like a technicality. So essentially, Alex Jones was found liable because he didn't comply with the court orders. It wasn't that the court actually said, yes, we actually listened to your words and we've determined that these words have caused harm and that these words were defamation. That didn't happen. So the families, these in this particular case, and another one in Connecticut, which has also been ruled by default, and Alex Jones will be facing either the judge or the jury in Connecticut, not sure which one. And he will be ordered then, to pay damages. And it's all because of default. So at this point, he has not been found to be guilty is not the right word because this is a civil case, but essentially like guilty of defamation. That did not happen in this case or in the one that's happening in Connecticut. But again, there are a couple more cases as well in Connecticut and another one in Texas that maybe if Alex Jones actually does comply with the court orders, because in this last one, he didn't turn over financial documents and other analytics documents, and he kind of waited on that and hemmed and hawed on that for a long time. And finally, the court basically said, all right, then you're just going to have to pay. But that's without saying, okay, you defamed these people. You lied, you did XYZ things. So he hasn't been found liable for any of that, just liable for not complying with the court. So that doesn't give these families the satisfaction that maybe they were looking for. I mean, they'll get money, but they're still not getting the satisfaction of saying, of the judge or the jury saying, yes, that Alex Jones's words were the problem here. So that is what happened in this case and in the case coming up in Connecticut. Now let's move on to this Scott Adams tweet that confused people and why Jones might not actually have to pay a dime. Do you have any idea what the Alex Jones verdict will do to my professional liability insurance rates? Free speech got a lot more expensive. Okay, so what is he talking about here? What? Liability insurance, professional liability insurance. That's right. So people like Alex Jones, Scott Adams, even myself have liability insurance. Many people have liability insurance that are in the professional space where they're talking, they're giving their opinions. It's just something you do if you have a business, a corporation. A lot of times they're going to require you to get some liability insurance. And that is going to cover you in an instance when someone wants to sue you for not only, there's many things that they could sue you for, defamation being one of those many things. So my guess is Alex Jones absolutely has insurance to cover defamation or any slander, libel, or anything else that he might be accused of. And it goes beyond that. I mean, there's sexual harassment claims, There's a variety of things that could fall under this liability insurance. So it is likely that Alex Jones has it. So what Scott Adams is saying is like, oh my gosh, now that Alex Jones has been ordered to pay all of this money, $50 million, the insurance company is going to be paying that because he has insurance, and that means everyone's rates are going to go up. That is what he's talking about. But that might not actually be the case. It's not, Alex Jones is not actually going to have to pay $50 million. That is just what the court ordered, but it's just to say, it's just moral posturing. There's actually a statute in Texas that doesn't allow for the court to award the plaintiffs that much money in punitive damages, and we'll get to that. But even if Alex Jones didn't have this insurance, the reports are that he actually has a lot of money. So the forensic, they call them like financial forensic scientists or something, they went through and they looked at all of Alex Jones's assets and whatnot, and they estimate that he's worth up to $270 million. Now, that's a lot of money. There was at one point in some of his text messages that ended up being turned over on accident to the plaintiff's attorneys. His defense attorney, which I think clearly showed to not be the best attorney, accidentally sent somebody on the defense team accidentally sent an entire boatload of documents and data that was private from Alex Jones to the plaintiff's attorneys, and then didn't challenge it. They had 12 days to challenge it, to say, hey, that's attorney-client privilege information. You need to return that back. Whoops, our bad. We didn't mean to send you that. But they didn't even challenge it. So it kind of makes me question, did they do it? Was it done on purpose to try to get a mistrial, which did not work? They tried to get a mistrial. They didn't get a mistrial. But anyway, or just bad, negligent, terrible attorneys, which very well could be the case. I'm sure it's difficult for Alex Jones to find an attorney that'll actually represent him. So, but look, $270 million is a lot of money. So obviously, though, he could afford the $50 million. But if he's facing several lawsuits that order him to pay $50 million each, he would go broke. But here's the thing. So let's get to the statute of limitations of how much a person can be liable for, at least in Texas. Unsure about Connecticut, but there's a statute that limits the amount someone can be ordered to pay. So here's actually the plaintiff's attorney attempting to explain it, but I'll explain it better after we see what he has to say.
A practical cap, right? There is a reasonable multiple. And that can be case specific. The Texas Supreme Court kind of decides that. What is a reasonable multiple of that? And so once you start approaching more something like 10, 15 times what the compensatory damage is, now you're starting to get over the multiple. So I think, a practical fear for Mr. Jones is he going to have to walk out of this courtroom paying $50 million? Or is he going to have to walk out of this courtroom paying $6 million? Right? What's the question here? I certainly don't think that tomorrow the jury's going to come back with a punitive damage verdict of $500,000. I don't think that's happening, right? I think the jury clearly made some choices in the room about compensating Scarlett and Neil first and then doing the punitive damages. I think it's reasonable to expect that Mr. Jones could be in deep, deep trouble.
Okay, so the reality is, at this point, with the rulings, with what he's been ordered to pay, Jones could be liable for $9.7 million maximum. So not $50 million, $9.7 million maximum, but it's likely a lot less than that. So let me explain. The actual Texas statute says the punitive damages can only amount to 2 times the amount of the economic damages, plus an amount equal to any non-economic damages found by the jury, not to exceed $750,000. So the maximum is 2 times the economic damages plus $750,000 per plaintiff. Okay. So what we know is that in the first round, the damages that were awarded were $4.11 million, and that was in compensatory damages, which could be economic or non-economic. So this is like pain and suffering, or it could be economic, like you had to move or you had hospital bills, like maybe mental health bills. You had to move your residence because people were threatening you. You had to hire security, right? So those are economic damages. You could tally up the receipts and say, this is how much you cost me. And you could even when they're dealing with economic damages, they could say, well, you couldn't work for a period of time, and because you couldn't work, this is what your income was worth. So we don't know out of that 4.1 million how much of that was economic damages and how much of it was pain and suffering. Pain and suffering is excluded from the calculation when they double the economic damages. So let's say out of the 4.1 million, that only 100,000 was economic damages and the other 4 million was pain and suffering. That means Alex Jones at most would pay double the economic damages. That would be 200,000 plus 750,000 per plaintiff. And in this situation, there were two plaintiffs, the mother and the father. So that would be 1.5 million plus $200,000. So that would be $1.7 million that Alex Jones would have to pay. Now let's reverse it. Let's say that the economic damages were $4 million and the non-economic damages, the pain and suffering, was only $100,000. Then Alex Jones would have to pay double the $4 million. That's $8 million plus the $1.5 million, because that's 750 per plaintiff. So he would then have to pay, let's say, $9.5 million. If all of it was economic, the 4.1, then that's where I get to the 9.7 million. If every dime of that 4.1 was economic and none of it was pain and suffering, that's not likely. Certainly a large chunk of that money was pain and suffering. So that's how the judge later, when they go back, so they just allow the jury to say, yeah, we're ordering you to pay $45 million. It's really just for a show of, we find you liable. This is how liable we think you are. It makes for good news headlines. It's just not the reality. So we don't know what that amount really is. The judge will look back at the $4.1 million award and break it up and say how much of this is economic, and then they will follow Texas statute. Now, I don't know what the Texas statute is in Connecticut. That could be different, or it could be very similar. But that's what's going on with this case. It's not really $50 million. At most, it's 9.7 million. That's if every ounce of that 4.1 million was economic damages. Not likely. I'm sure most of it was probably pain and suffering. Now, let's talk about the implications of this case. So even though he wasn't found liable for his words and only by default, there is still a precedent that's being set that's consequential. And it's really consequential to all of us who question narratives. Now, first of all, the Sandy Hook killings were an absolute shock and horror to all of us. I think we all cried that day and couldn't imagine how any monster could do such a horrible thing. And though it's incredibly disturbing for many of us that Alex Jones questioned that event and made money off of this questioning and put these parents through all that pain and suffering from all that questioning, it is incredibly important that we are able to question without consequence. Even events that others consider absolutely decided, like 9/11 or the moon landing. It's our right to question and to even say we don't believe it happened. Even if everyone else looks at you like you're crazy, we have to have the ability to say, I don't think that exists, or I don't believe that happened, or happened the way they claimed. I mean, could you imagine the implications if we're not allowed to question? Can now victims of 9/11, after this type of judgment, now again, this judgment was a default judgment, so this wasn't actually holding him liable for his words. So people like myself and others who question narratives, which is many of us in independent media, questioning the narratives, this ruling didn't quite set that precedent just yet. Right. So because it was a default judgment, it hasn't had that consequence on that ability to question. But it could. We don't know if Alex Jones will actually show up to court, actually comply with what the court asks, and actually go forward with a full-on court battle to determine whether or not he's liable. I think many of us in the media would prefer he not actually, and that just continue the default judgments, because if he is found liable, and you have to remember, so many people hate Alex Jones. This is a lot of this. Now, I've never watched a full episode of his, so I don't know what he said even about Sandy Hook. I hear what people tell me that he said. They say that he called it a hoax, that he called the parents crisis actors. I haven't heard the actual or seen the full episode, so I don't know what framing was around that. Did he assert it as fact? Or was it obviously his opinion that Sandy Hook didn't happen? Or is it was he questioning like he questions absolutely everything? Was that something that he was continuing to? I don't actually know with Alex Jones what he said or didn't say. All I know is the implications. Now, if he said something of fact that was defamatory against the parents, that then, that then maybe there is something there. But if he was questioning the event, that is an extremely dangerous thing if a jury or a judge does turn around and say, yeah, we think that you're not allowed to do that. Could all of the people that had family members die in 9/11, could they turn around and say anyone who questions 9/11, the events of 9/11, or whether or not 9/11 was an inside job or done by Al Qaeda or Saudis or whoever, anyone who questions it, could they be then held liable? Anyone who, just imagine when, and this did happen. So it kind of reverts us back to the era where the government the church ran the government basically and said, don't question God. And if you question God, that's actually illegal. That's against the law because, of course, God exists. That's what their framing was. And so how dare you be so careless and such a conspiracy theorist to say God doesn't exist? We have to be able to question anything that the government puts out there. We have to be able to question events. We have to be able to question these things. Now, it's one thing if you're withholding information, if you're negligent and you withhold that information and to smear somebody, that is, defamation is it's a tough category because what is the difference between actually defaming and opinion? And that's where it gets really, really tricky. But in this situation, I think it is important, no matter how abhorrent you think it is, that Alex Jones questions Sandy Hook, which, like I said, many of us watched the news that day and absolutely cried that these young children were murdered in cold blood, the way that they were, the terror that those children felt. It's atrocious. And many of us feel that again for the Uvalde shooting. It's atrocious. So even if but putting that aside, and you have to be able to put that aside, to be able to then say, but it's Alex Jones's right, and it's anyone's right to say, I don't believe that happened, or I don't believe that happened the way they say it happened. We have to maintain that ability because we need that ability to be able to question things that truly should be questioned, right? So unclear where Alex Jones may or may not have crossed the line. That didn't play out in court. That wasn't the question in court. So that's where we're at with this and where we're at with the next case in Connecticut, because again, that's a default ruling. So there you have it. Now, I do want to finish with this clip that went viral because many can't understand why people like Alex Jones. Why would anyone listen to him? And it's because of his questioning and challenging of the narratives that makes him popular with his supporters. So, especially when his observations and questioning are so obvious, yet are still viewed as conspiracy theories like this.
One of the things you've been talking about on your show is your allegation that government officials are aiding in pedophilia, child trafficking, and the grooming of children, right?
Well, you mean like what Jeffrey Epstein did with the Clintons?
Okay, so yeah, is that a conspiracy? I think we all know, many of us would say, no, that type of thing's not a conspiracy. So that is why Alex Jones has built his following, why people do actually like him, is because he does say things that go against the establishment, that go against the norm, that they're unwilling to question, and Alex Jones is willing to question it. That is why he's liked. So, but just wanted to kind of clarify what this case was and what it wasn't, whether or not Alex Jones is really going to have to pay all of this money, not likely. How much is he going to have to pay? Unsure. What are the ramifications and the implications of this case? Could be pretty important for those of us in independent media. So that is why I wanted to cover this today. So thank you so much for joining me. Appreciate your support. Please be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss an episode. And be sure to join my locals community. I do casual live streams, answer your questions. It's a great place to get to know other people and their thoughts and interact with one another. And so you can go ahead and click on that link below. Thank you guys so much for watching.